Melanie Carter stands up against blatant prejudice in a courtroom where the odds seem stacked against her. What happens when the judge steps in to confront the injustice and changes the entire trajectory of the case? Before diving into this powerful story of resilience and fairness, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that reveal the triumph of the human spirit. The courtroom buzzed with quiet conversations as people settled into their seats. Melanie Carter stood at the defendant's table, her back straight and hands clasped in front of her. Dressed in a modest yet professional black blazer and skirt, she radiated a calm confidence that belied the turbulence in her heart. Across the room, Ethan Barlow leaned casually against his table, his tailored suit a sharp contrast to Melanie's simpler attire. His smirk carried an unmistakable air of superiority. "You sure you don't want to reconsider?" Ethan said, his voice cutting through the hum of the courtroom. "Representing yourself is bold, but it might not be the wisest move." Melanie met his gaze without flinching. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Barlow, but I'll take my chances." Ethan chuckled and turned back to his notes, shaking his head. To him, this was already a closed case. Melanie's opponent was a wealthy real estate developer who had hired Ethan to ensure they walked away with the disputed property. Melanie, on the other hand, was just a black woman from a working-class neighborhood. What chance did she have against someone like him? The clerk's voice echoed across the room. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Irene Wallace." The murmurs ceased as everyone stood. Judge Wallace, a silver-haired woman with an air of authority, strode to her seat. She glanced at the opposing tables, her sharp eyes taking in Melanie's composure and Ethan's smug demeanor. After everyone sat, she adjusted her glasses and spoke. "Good morning. Let's get straight to the matter at hand," she said. "This is a property dispute case between Melanie Carter and Hamilton Development Group. Ms. Carter, I see you've chosen to represent yourself. Are you prepared to proceed?" Melanie nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." "Very well. Mr. Barlow, you may begin." Ethan stood and walked to the center of the courtroom, exuding confidence. "Your Honor, this case is quite simple. My client, Hamilton Development Group, legally purchased the property in question. Ms. Carter's refusal to vacate the premises is not only a breach of contract, but also an obstruction to progress. My client has plans to transform the area into a state-of-the-art commercial complex, which will—" He paused, letting the words sink in. Then he turned toward Melanie with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "While Ms. Carter's passion for her family home is admirable, it's ultimately irrelevant. The law is clear, and the facts are on our side." Ethan walked back to his table, adjusting his cuffs as if he'd already won. Melanie took a deep breath and rose from her seat. The eyes of the courtroom followed her as she moved to the center, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady but firm. "I understand Mr. Barlow's argument, but I must respectfully disagree. The property in question has been in my family for 3 generations. My grandparents bought that home with the little savings they had after moving to this city to escape Jim Crow laws in the South. It's more than just a house. It's a legacy." Ethan let out a quiet scoff, but Melanie didn't falter. "Your Honor," she continued, "the document that Mr. Barlow's client claims as proof of purchase is riddled with inconsistencies. The signature attributed to me was forged, and I have evidence to prove." The courtroom murmured as Melanie pulled out a stack of documents. She handed them to the bailiff, who brought them to the judge. Ethan's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "Forged?" Ethan interjected, standing abruptly. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Carter. Do you have any expert testimony to back that up?" "I do," Melanie said, her gaze unwavering. "I consulted a handwriting analyst who confirmed the discrepancies. The report is included in the documents I just submitted." Judge Wallace glanced over the papers, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Barlow, you'll have the opportunity to review this evidence and respond in due course. For now, please allow Miss Carter to finish." Ethan sat down, his jaw tight. Melanie continued, her voice gaining strength. "In addition, Your Honor, I have records showing that my property taxes are fully paid, and the deed to the house is in my name. I believe Hamilton Development Group exploited loopholes to create a false narrative of ownership. Melanie's words hung in the air, resonating with the quiet intensity of truth. Judge Wallace looked up from the papers and fixed Ethan with a piercing gaze. "Mr. Barlow, you may cross-examine." Ethan rose again, this time with a tighter grip on his notes. His tone was no longer dismissive, but measured, calculated. "Miss Carter," he began, "you mentioned hiring a handwriting analyst. Who paid for that analysis?" "I did," Melanie replied. "I used my savings." "Impressive," Ethan said with a thin smile. "And did you also pay for the legal consultation needed to interpret property tax records and deeds?" "No," Malachi admitted. "I did that research myself." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Yourself? So you're telling this court that, with no legal training, you're qualified to interpret property law?" Melanie straightened her shoulders. "I don't claim to be a lawyer, Mr. Barlow, but I do claim to be resourceful and determined, and I trust this court to see the truth." The subtle applause from the back of the courtroom was quickly silenced by Judge Wallace's gavel. "Order," she said firmly. Ethan's frustration was becoming evident. He adjusted his tie and leaned forward, his tone turning patronizing. "Miss Carter, do you understand the implications of what you're doing here? This is a courtroom, not a debate club. Real lives and real money are at stake." Melanie met his condescension with quiet strength. "I am fully aware of what's at stake, Mr. Barlow. That's why I'm here." Ethan opened his mouth to retort, but Judge Wallace cut him off. "That's enough, Mr. Barlow. You've made your point." Melanie returned to her seat, her heart pounding. Ethan's questions had been pointed, but she knew she'd held her ground. The judge's expression softened as she addressed the courtroom. "This case raises significant questions about the validity of the documents presented by both parties. I will need time to review the evidence thoroughly. We will reconvene tomorrow morning." As the gavel struck, the tension in the room broke. Melanie gathered her papers, her fingers trembling slightly as the weight of the day hit her. Ethan's voice stopped her as she stood. "You put up a good fight, Miss Carter," he said, his smirk returning. "But good intentions don't win cases." Melanie smiled faintly. "We'll see about that, Mr. Barlow." With that, she turned and walked out of the courtroom, her head held high. The next morning, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. News of Melanie Carter's poised defense against the seasoned Ethan Barlow had spread. The gallery was fuller than the day before, with curious onlookers and a few reporters ready to capture the drama. Melanie sat at her table, reviewing her notes with laser focus. Ethan, across the room, seemed unusually quiet, though his polished demeanor hadn't cracked. Judge Wallace entered, her gavel immediately silencing the room. "Let's resume," she announced. "Miss Carter, please take the stand to clarify your claim." Melanie walked to the witness stand, her heels echoing in the silent room. The weight of the moment pressed on her, but she straightened her shoulders and faced Ethan with calm determination. Ethan rose, his expression a mask of professional courtesy. "Miss Carter," he began, pacing slowly, "you've presented evidence suggesting the signature on the sales document was forged. Yet your case hinges on the assumption that my client intentionally sought to deceive you. Do you have proof of intent?" Melanie nodded. "Yes, I do." The courtroom murmured. Ethan stopped pacing, caught off guard. "Proof of intent," he repeated. "Yes," Melanie replied, her voice unwavering. "I found emails exchanged between Hamilton Development Group and a third-party broker discussing ways to expedite the transfer of ownership. These emails specifically mention the challenges of acquiring a property from a stubborn homeowner, me." Ethan's jaw tightened. "And how exactly did you obtain these emails?" Melanie took a breath. "When I realized something was wrong with the sale, I filed a Freedom of Information Act request to access communications related to the transaction. It took weeks, but I got what I needed." The courtroom rippled with murmurs again. Judge Wallace rapped her gavel. "Quiet, please." Ethan forced a smile. A creative effort, Ms. Carter, but creativity doesn't equate to admissibility. Your Honor, I question the relevance of these emails. Judge Wallace raised an eyebrow. Mr. Barlow, the relevance will be determined by this court. Continue, Ms. Carter. Melanie nodded. The emails reveal that Hamilton Development Group pressured the broker to rush the sale, even after I refused their initial offers. They discussed forging my signature to finalize the deal before the City Council's zoning meeting. These emails are part of the records I submitted yesterday. Judge Wallace sifted through the documents on her desk, her expression hardening as she scanned the pages. Ethan shifted uneasily at his table. "Mr. Barlow," the judge said, her voice sharp, "I suggest you prepare to explain these communications." Ethan quickly stood. "Your Honor, I'd like to question the validity of these emails. Without proper verification, we cannot confirm their authenticity." Melanie didn't flinch. "I anticipated that argument. I contacted the broker directly. He's prepared to testify." The courtroom gasped. Ethan's mask of confidence slipped as he fumbled with his notes. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." "What's irregular?" Judge Wallace interrupted. "Is the possibility that your client engaged in unethical practices. We'll hear from this broker. Ms. Carter, please call your witness." The doors to the courtroom opened, and a nervous-looking man in a gray suit entered. He took the stand, glancing nervously at Ethan and then at Melanie, as if silently apologizing for the position he was in. "State your name and occupation for the record," Judge Wallace instructed. "My name is Robert Jenkins, and I'm a real estate broker," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. Melanie stood. "Mr. Jenkins, you were involved in facilitating the attempted sale of my property to Hamilton Development Group. Can you confirm the authenticity of the emails I submitted?" Jenkins swallowed hard, visibly sweating under the scrutiny. "Yes, those emails are real." Ethan shot to his feet. "Your Honor, I object. This testimony is coerced." Judge Wallace glared at Ethan. "Sit down, Mr. Barlow." Ethan reluctantly obeyed, his face flushed. Melanie pressed forward. "Mr. Jenkins, why did you proceed with the sale, knowing the signature on the document was forged?" Jenkins hesitated, then sighed. "Hamilton Development Group is a powerful client. They implied that my future business prospects would suffer if I didn't cooperate." The gallery erupted in whispers. Judge Wallace's gavel cracked against her desk, bringing silence. "Order! Mr. Jenkins, are you stating that Hamilton Development Group knowingly instructed you to facilitate a fraudulent sale?" Jenkins nodded, his face pale. "Yes, Your Honor." Ethan stood again, his composure cracking. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. My client denies any involvement in such actions." Judge Wallace folded her hands, her gaze icy. "We'll see, Mr. Barlow. Continue, Miss Carter." Melanie locked eyes with Ethan, her calm gaze a sharp contrast to his unraveling composure. "Mr. Jenkins, do you have any additional records that support your testimony?" "Yes," Jenkins replied. "I brought copies of the original communications and the forged signature document." The bailiff collected the papers and handed them to Judge Wallace. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the judge reviewed the evidence. "Miss Carter," Ethan said, his voice tight, "you've made your point clear. But even if we accept these claims, isn't it true that you've delayed progress on a project that could benefit this city?" Melanie turned to face him fully, her voice steady and filled with conviction. "Benefit for whom, Mr. Barlow? The city or wealthy developers who see my community as an inconvenience? My family built our home brick by brick. This isn't just about me. It's about preserving the integrity of a neighborhood that developers like your clients see as expendable." The gallery erupted into applause, cutting off Ethan's retort. Judge Wallace pounded her gavel, though even she couldn't suppress a small smile. "That's enough," she said. "This court will review the evidence submitted by both parties. We'll reconvene after a short recess." The judge rose and exited, leaving a courtroom buzzing with energy. Ethan stared at Melanie, his confidence visibly shaken. Melanie returned to her seat, a quiet triumph shining in her eyes. For the first time since the trial began, she felt the scales of justice beginning to tip in her favor. The courtroom was electric with tension as everyone returned from the recess. The gallery was even more crowded now, filled with reporters and community members who had caught wind of the case. Melanie Carter sat at her table, her hands folded neatly over a stack of papers. She glanced across the room at Ethan Barlow, whose once cocky demeanor had been replaced by visible tension. His client, seated beside him, whispered furiously into his ear. Ethan nodded tersely but avoided eye contact with Melanie. Judge Wallace entered, her robe sweeping behind her as she approached the bench. She adjusted her glasses and surveyed the room, her expression firm and commanding. "This court has reviewed all submitted evidence," she began, her voice slicing through the silence. "Before delivering my ruling, I will allow closing statements. Mr. Barlow, you may proceed." Ethan rose, smoothing his tie as he walked to the center of the courtroom. Though his steps were measured, the tightness in his shoulders betrayed his unease. "Your Honor, members of the court," Ethan began, his voice polished but lacking its earlier confidence. "While Ms. Carter has presented a compelling narrative, it is critical to focus on the larger picture. My client, Hamilton Development Group, is committed to improving this city. The project in question will bring economic growth, create jobs, and uplift the community. While we understand Ms. Carter's emotional attachment to her home, progress sometimes requires difficult choices." Ethan paused, glancing briefly at the judge. "The law is on our side, Your Honor. We respectfully request that the court dismiss Ms. Carter's claims and allow this vital project to move forward." He returned to his seat, avoiding Melanie's gaze as he sat down. Judge Wallace turned her attention to Melanie. "Ms. Carter, your closing statement." Melanie stood, her heart pounding as she made her way to the center of the room. She took a deep breath, letting the gravity of the moment ground her. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, "progress is important, but it cannot come at the expense of justice. My home is more than just a piece of property. It's a symbol of resilience, history, and community. My grandparents fled systemic oppression to build a life here. They poured their blood, sweat, and tears into that house, hoping to create a better future for their children and grandchildren." Melanie's gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of spectators who nodded in silent support. "The evidence shows that Hamilton Development Group used fraudulent means to claim ownership of my home. If this court allows their actions to go unchecked, it sends a message that power and money can override integrity and the law." Her voice rose, filled with conviction. "This case is not just about me. It's about protecting the rights of ordinary people against those who believe they are untouchable. I trust this court to uphold those rights." Melanie returned to her seat, her head held high. The room was silent, save for the sound of pens scratching on reporters' notepads. Judge Wallace adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. "This court has considered the arguments and evidence presented by both parties," she said, her tone deliberate. "The emails submitted by Ms. Carter, corroborated by the testimony of Mr. Jenkins, reveal clear intent by Hamilton Development Group to defraud Ms. Carter of her property. This is not only unethical but also illegal." Ethan's face turned pale, and his client sank lower in his chair. Judge Wallace continued, her expression unyielding. "Furthermore, the court finds that the document presented as proof of sale contains a forged signature. As such, this court rules in favor of the defendant, Ms. Carter. The property remains under her rightful ownership." The gavel struck, punctuating her words with finality. The gallery erupted in applause, cheers filling the room as Melanie closed her eyes and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. For a moment, the weight of the fight lifted, replaced by a swell of pride and relief. Ethan stood abruptly, his composure crumbling. "Your Honor, Mr. Barlow," Judge Wallace interrupted sharply. "This ruling is final. I suggest you and your client consider the consequences of your actions moving forward." Ethan sat down, defeated, as his client began berating him in hushed tones. Melanie turned to face the crowd, her face breaking into a radiant smile as community members approached her with words of congratulations and gratitude. Outside the courthouse, the sun shone brightly as Melanie descended the steps, flanked by reporters shouting questions. She held up a hand, signaling for quiet. "This victory isn't just mine," she said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "It belongs to everyone who believes in justice and refuses to back down in the face of injustice. I hope this case inspires others to fight for what's right, no matter how impossible it seems." The reporters scrambled to capture her words, while onlookers applauded. A woman in her 60s stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, grasping Melanie's hands. "You've given us hope." Melanie squeezed her hands gently. "We all deserve justice. Never forget that." As the crowd began to disperse, Melanie spotted Judge Wallace exiting the courthouse. Their eyes met, and the judge gave her a small nod, a quiet acknowledgement of her strength. Melanie nodded back, silently vowing to honor the moment. That evening, Melanie sat on the porch of her family home, gazing at the setting sun. The fight was over, but its lessons would stay with her forever. She knew there were others out there facing similar battles, and now she was ready to help. Her phone buzzed with messages from neighbors, local activists, and even law firms offering to collaborate. Melanie smiled, her heart full. She had fought for her home and won, but more importantly, she had ignited a flame of hope in her community. As the stars began to dot the night sky, Melanie whispered to herself, "This is just the beginning."